If you'll please stand for the reading. It can be found in the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 24 through 35. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay his debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. "Be patient with me," he begged, "and I will pay back everything." The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay you back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart. This ends the reading of the gospel.
Thanks be to God.
We had a skit scheduled for today. Unfortunately, the person who was going to do that fell ill yesterday evening, and so we will do the skit another time. So do you remember math problems that were word problems? Do you remember that? Because I don't know if that gets taught today or not. You know, the ones that start like this. If a southbound train leaves Dallas, traveling at 100 miles per hour, and a northbound train leaves San Antonio, traveling at 95 miles an hour, how long will it take each of them to get to Austin? And in order to calculate the right answer, you have to know or figure out how many miles it is from Austin to San Antonio and Austin to Dallas. And this kind of problem was designed to help a person think logically, to solve for the answer by applying mathematical equations. So for all of you mathematical types out there, we expect an answer by the end of the worship service. But in today's gospel reading, Peter he asked a spiritual question, and we may not have gotten that exactly in the reading, but you're going to be familiar with the story when I tell you about it. He was asking a spiritual question, but he was trying to solve it mathematically. "Lord, if someone sins against me, how often should I forgive? As often as 7 times?" Now, here's the deal. Peter already knew what the right answer was according to the Torah, according to the law. Because in Jewish law, it was written, if a person transgresses 1 time, forgive them. If a person transgresses 2 times, forgive them. If a person transgresses 3 times, forgive them. If a person transgresses 4 times, do not forgive. 3 times. That was the mathematical answer. But Peter was a good student, and Jesus had surprised him from time to time about what was expected. So when Peter asked if forgiving someone 7 times was enough, he thought that he had given enough leeway for even Jesus's high ideals. Right? I mean, that's a lot. If they said don't forgive after 4 or after 3, 7 was a bunch. And we also can't overlook the fact that numbers held symbolic significance in Hebrew, and 7 is the number of perfection or completeness. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. Completion. So from Peter's perspective, 7 times should have been more than enough. But Jesus surprised everybody when he said, no, not 7 times, but I tell you, 7 times 70. 77 times. Scholars have debated whether this means 77 times or 490 times, but either way, that is a whole lot of forgiveness.
Thank you, Jesus.
We should hear that number as another way of saying an infinite number of times, or as often as forgiveness is needed or requested. Well, Jesus, how did you get to that answer? Because the math doesn't add up. And really, it isn't the math, since this actually is a spiritual question. How is it possible to forgive that much? Well, Jesus tells a word story of his own, a parable about a king and his slaves. That's what got read this morning. The king wanted to settle accounts with one of his slaves, and that slave was brought before him and owed him 10,000 talents. Now here's an interesting bit of biblical trivia. 10,000 was the biggest number imaginable to the Hebrews at that time. That was as many zeros as they could put left of the decimal as they could think of. Now, I'm not saying other people, the Egyptians and others, weren't smart, didn't do other things. I'm just saying for the Hebrews, 10,000 was like the biggest number that they could imagine. And according to Josephus, a Jewish historian, the entire Roman tax imposed upon the Jewish people amounted to only 600 talents. So they're telling a story about somebody who owes 10,000. The whole tax that the Jewish people owed the Romans was 600. 10,000 talents was such an enormous sum, it couldn't be paid back in 490 lifetimes, much less in 77 lifetimes. Well, the king threatens to throw the slave into prison, and the slave begs for mercy. Just give me a little bit more time, I'll pay you back. But the king knew that was impossible. He had compassion for the slave, and he did the next most unimaginable thing. He forgave that slave the whole debt. Now, other than talking about Jesus dying for us on the cross, I'm just going to ask you to think about, no show of hands, no that, but can you think of a time when someone has forgiven you a debt that you could never pay back? Man, that's incredible. Another slave, this slave who had been forgiven this huge debt, well, what happens next gives us a clue about why forgiveness is so important. Because this one that had been forgiven so much, more than he could ever pay back, ever, runs into a fellow slave that owed him 100 denarii. My math is very, very rusty. So just for argument's sake, let's say it was $100. He owed him $100. And the first slave put his hands around the second slave's throat and demanded to be paid back. And when the other slaves saw this, they reported it to the king, who was none too pleased with the first slave's actions. He said to him, I forgave you a debt you could never repay, and here you are threatening somebody over $100? Why did you not have mercy like I showed you mercy? And the king had the slave thrown into prison until he could pay the debt, which meant that he would be in prison forever. Jesus concluded the parable by telling his listeners that they had to forgive from the heart. That they had to forgive from the heart. Now, has anybody in this room ever tossed an I'm sorry over your shoulder, but you didn't mean it?
Hello.
Now, come on. Don't need a show of hands. I'm just saying it's possible that maybe it's possible that somebody, when confronted with something, said, all right, I'm sorry. Really? But see, this forgiveness isn't a math problem, Jesus points out. It's a question of grace. It's a question of grace. What does it look like or feel like to receive and offer forgiveness from one's heart? Well, in order to know that, I want to just go over a few things that forgiveness is not. I want to talk about a couple of things that forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not forgetting. In the first place, deep hurts can rarely be wiped out of one's awareness. If something horrible happened to you, if somebody did something horrible to you, if you did something horrible to someone else, you can't just wipe that out of your awareness. It's still there. God allows us to retain memories, good and bad, so that we'll have a guide to keep us from making the same mistakes over and again, whether it's a mistake of our own making or an injury done to us. After the Holocaust of the Jews during World War II, another law was added to the 613 laws to be observed by Orthodox Jews. It was one that was spoken more than anything else, but the 614th law is, "Thou shalt not forget." Thou shalt not forget. Forgiveness is not condoning or dismissing the hurtful behavior. To forgive someone does not mean that now all is okay or that there won't be consequences for someone's actions. To forgive someone does not mean that you don't take the offense seriously. If somebody has hurt you, they hurt you. If you've hurt somebody else, you hurt them. But you don't have to condone it. And forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. When somebody says to you, "I'm sorry," when you trust that that comes from their heart, you can forgive them. But reconciliation takes effort on both sides of the conflict. It takes effort on both sides. It is possible to forgive another person even when that person isn't sorry or doesn't acknowledge doing anything wrong. And just because you've forgiven someone doesn't mean that you have to go right back into the same relationship to risk the same kind of abuse. That's not what forgiveness is. In order to forgive, we need to let go of our impulse to get revenge or to hold on to the hurt until the grudge causes us as much or more damage than the original hurt. There's a Chinese proverb that gives this sage advice: the person who seeks revenge should dig 2 graves. An attitude of unforgiveness is just as deadly to the person who holds the grudge as the one who committed the wrong in the first place. And it may not be a physical death, although it could be, but holding fast to bitterness and anger certainly contributes to a spiritual death. We talk a lot about forgiveness, and it's hard to do. And yet, first and foremost, it is a gift from God. Like the king who forgave an unpayable debt, God, through Jesus Christ, has forgiven us for every sin we have committed or will commit. You know, preachers say that a lot. People say that a lot. If you take some time to really ponder what that means every lie, every piece of gossip, every shirking of duty, everything that we've ever done or still will do, Jesus has already forgiven. He's already said, "I love you enough. I paid the debt for you." Doesn't mean there may not be consequences, but it does mean that we are not destined to some kind of horrible death in sin. This gift is so amazing. God extends forgiveness even when we aren't sorry and even when we haven't acknowledged that we have done anything wrong, because that's the nature of God. And we realize the full benefit of forgiveness when we take God's mercy, compassion, and love to heart. And we become conduits of forgiveness ourselves. In another place, in another time, I did a class on forgiveness. There were about 8 people in the room. Some of them had experienced some really awful things, including one young woman who had been seriously abused by a family member. And she came to me and she said, I just don't know how I'm ever going to be able to forgive. What this person did was so awful. It was so horrible. And yes, it was. And we worked through the process. We worked through what forgiveness is and what it isn't. We talked about all of those things. She decided that she would work on her own heart, that that's where she would start. And so, through the course of time, over several years, not instantaneously, she worked on how it would be that she could tell this person that she forgave them, because the biggest thing that she wanted in her asking for them to tell this person that she forgave them was for them to say, I'm sorry. That's what she wanted, was to hear, I'm sorry, from this person. And we worked through all of this stuff to say, you know what? The person who hurt you, they may never say, I'm sorry. But if you want to be well, if you want to be whole, you may need to come to a place where you can say that you have forgiven this person, regardless of what their response is.
Amen.
I'm so very blessed to be able to tell you that this person, the person that abused her, the person that hurt her, got sick, and before he died, she was able to go to him and from her heart say to him that she forgave him. And he never said, I'm sorry, ever. And she still is whole and joyful and talks with others about the great gift of forgiveness that God gave her. The theme today on our table that we are continuing to prepare for World Communion Sunday, the theme is the table of peace. We added the communion cup and the communion plate because I can't think of anything more powerful than communion to remind us of forgiveness. It's absolutely imperative how we see that, how we understand that. I would suggest to you that this table of peace is just as much about the peace we're going to find in our own hearts when we let go of anger or looking for revenge or getting what is owed to us. Leonard Sweet reminds us that our ability to forgive is always and ever linked to Jesus' love for us and God's compassionate forgiveness. If we look at forgiveness as a math problem, we're never going to be able to balance the books. But if we look at forgiveness as a spiritual exercise, one that connects us with the gracious mercy of God, then we realize that God has provided more than enough for us to forgive as often as it is needed, either for the sake of the one who is offended and has asked for forgiveness or for our sake, that love, not bitterness, rule in our hearts. Is it easy? No. Is it necessary? Absolutely. It's so necessary that we even pray about it. Do you remember? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Those words are very powerful. As a matter of fact, they're so powerful, it might do us some good to say them together.
Thank you, Jesus.
And so would you pray with me the prayer that Jesus taught us, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Let the people of God say again, Amen.